Today we're going to talk about the effects of the Horas. So some of the old texts will give the results of the Hora being, of the Lagna being in this or this sign, or things like that. So we're going to cover those things today. One of the important things that's mentioned in Jataka Parijata is that Surya is strong in the solar Hora, Chandra is strong in the lunar Hora. So he's emphasizing these two planets in the Hora, the sun and the moon. We want ideally the sun to be in its own Hora, obviously, and the moon to be in its own Hora, obviously. And that's pretty obvious if you think about it for a minute. But it's interesting that he decides to write it down. It is so obvious. Why write it down? Well, it's because he doesn't want us to forget how important that is, or make sure we don't, miss that point. The sun and moon being the lords of the Horas are the most important planets in the Hora. And like we talked about, the moon is the most important planet in the Hora chart to read in the Hora chart. Okay, so when you get the Hora chart and you have the chart and you look at the well-being of the moon and its dignity, the influences to it and all that stuff, the moon's the most important planet. But when it comes to looking at the sun and moon as planets in your chart to help you have a good life, the Horas of the sun and moon are really important, okay? More important than the Horas for any other planet. Meaning whether any other planets in the Hora of the sun or moon is not as important as if the sun is in the sun's Hora or the moon's in the moon's Hora. If you have the sun in the sun's Hora and the moon's in the moon's Hora, right away you have a lot more capacity for finding satisfaction in your responsibilities and in your life. If it's the opposite way, right away you get frustrated with that. Okay? After looking at the sun and moon and seeing if they're in desirable Horas, then the other planets are important after that, but only after that. Okay? And you're actually better off having the sun and moon in their own Horas and having all the other planets in the wrong Hora than you are having the sun and moon bad and all the other planets in the right Horas. Okay, the sun and moon set up that foundation for your satisfaction because ultimately we have to be satisfied with ourselves in our life, right? And that's the sun and moon. If we're satisfied with ourselves in our life, then all the other satisfaction that the other planets represent will be more easily to obtain, and if they're unobtainable, more easy to bear. Okay, but when we're not satisfied with ourselves in our life, because the sun and moon Hora are incorrect, then even if those other things have more capacity for satisfaction, we won't be as satisfied. So the sun and moon sort of show our capacity as an individual for satisfaction on planet Earth, living in a material world, okay, or a concrete world. Now, it's important and nice for both men and women to have both the sun and moon in their own Hora, meaning the sun in the sun's Hora and the moon's in the moon's Hora. But it's more important for men to have the sun in the sun's Hora and the woman to have the moon in the moon's Hora than it is the other way around. So if you're only going to have one of those in its right Hora, you're more fortunate if you're male and it's the sun, and if you're female, you're luckier if it's the moon that's in the moon's Hora. Okay? Alright. So, when the sun is in its own Hora, then a person has a greater capacity to decide what they want in their future, to decide what they want to take care of in their future, to make the sacrifices they need to fulfill, to create the life of responsibilities that they want, and to make it happen. So if the sun's in the sun's Hora, the person has that ability much more so. Okay? And again, why is satisfaction so much tied into responsibility? Because if you think about it, so much of our life has to do with our responsibilities, right? It's a big portion of life. It's the biggest portion of life. And the free time on top of that is small, relatively. So anyway, so that's what happens when the sun's in its own Hora. That capacity to set out and build the life one wants, largely which revolves around responsibilities, and therefore find satisfaction in it is high. If the sun's in the moon's Hora, though, And the person feels like everything that they really want to create the most, somehow eludes them, or they're not able to make it happen completely, and instead they find themselves with other types of responsibilities that they're not really sure that they want. So as a result, they're never quite satisfied with those things, even if they're great things. Okay? Now, in a man's horoscope, the sun is the masculine male planet. So men have more solar energy, and that's why they have male bodies, and women have more lunar energy, which is why they have female bodies. So in a man's chart, you want ideally to have that sun in that sun's hora, because for a man, his happiness in life and satisfaction in life is more dependent upon him being able to do the great things that he hopes to achieve to the level he wants to, without being tied up into a bunch of things that he just kind of comes to resent because he really didn't want them in the first place, okay, or would just feel like burdens and really not what he really wished to do, okay. So it's important for men to be able to create their destiny, to envision their future, and to achieve it, and a bigger part of their satisfaction will be revolving around that part of themselves, okay. Now the moon, on the other hand, we want that to be in the moon's hora, because the moon is a planet that needs closeness, it needs affection, it needs validation, it needs security, and it needs the things it takes care of and the things it's responsible for to somehow take part in that validation and take part in creating that security, okay? And when the moon's in the moon's hora, it's very much able to do that. It's able to have more intimate, caring relationships with people, and with people that are involved in its responsibilities, with its family, with its loved ones. It has the capacity to feel validated in those things, doing things with the family, taking care of the family. And it has the greater capacity to feel nurtured and loved by family members and other members that are part of their responsibilities. So it creates a nice, warm environment for a lot of mutual care to happen, a lot of validation to happen. So the moon has really become satisfied and feels like it's, creating warmth, but also receiving warmth, okay? And that the things it's doing are worth doing because they're appreciated, and also worth doing because they're validating at the same time. And most importantly, it helps that person, when the moon is in the moon's hora, to be part of something bigger than themselves. And that's what the moon wants. If you read in Parashara, one of the descriptions of the moon, he says the moon is lovesick. Okay? That lovesick doesn't just mean that the moon is pining away over a lost love of some guy that it wants to be with. Lovesick means that it has a yearning to be part of something greater than itself, whether that's a community, a family, a relationship, whatever. And it has a great need for that. If it can be part of that, be bonded to something greater to itself, be intimately connected to something that's important to it, then the moon feels happy and grounded and secure. And that's so much more possible for a person who has the moon in the moon's hora. When the moon, on the other hand, is in the sun's hora, that moon becomes much more impersonal. That moon is forced to adopt a greater sense of sacrifice in their life. So their needs are getting sacrificed for the needs of the greater, but in such a way that they don't feel connected to that greater thing. Because the moon is happy to give up its needs when it feels connected and part of that greater thing. But when the moon is in the sun's hora, it's required to make sacrifices, but it never really feels like it's connected to something greater. So the sacrifices it makes aren't validating, aren't rewarding, basically aren't satisfying, and aren't validating. So the moon in the sun's hora just has a much harder time having its needs met, and having its need met to be part of something greater, whether it's a community, a family, or whatever. And so because of that, the moon just is a little more starved. And the moon in the sun's hora will also be looking always for, thinking it needs something else quite often. Sometimes maybe something will be right by it that it could actually be part of, but it's just somehow can't quite embrace it. Being in the sun's hora, the moon just can't fully embrace being a part of something. It's just part of how that moon works then. So there'll be a tendency for the moon to always be thinking about, what it could be a part of, who it could be a part of, or thinking about something else it could be doing instead of taking advantage of the possibilities right in front of it. But it can't take advantage of those possibilities because it just doesn't have that personal capacity for intimacy the same way that the moon does when it's in its own hora. Okay? So, in a woman's chart, it's more important to have the moon in the moon's hora than the sun's in the sun's hora. So if you can only have one and you're female, hopefully you're in the moon's hora, because overall it'll give a larger degree of satisfaction in life. Because feminine energy has a stronger need, because it's more moon-ruled, to cure that love sickness of the moon, to really be bonded to something, to be intimately involved with something, to be secure and safe with something greater than itself. And greater than itself is not meant as a demeaning term, okay? It just means being part of something that includes itself but is more than just itself all alone, okay? Kind of like you have a clock, and in the clock there's all these really cool gears, and you can pull out these gears and say, wow, that's a really cool gear. I mean, look at the workmanship on that little tiny gear. And oh look, there's even gems in this clock. Like good watches have like 14 gems or something in them. They'll use like rubies and sapphires as part of the clock mechanism. So you got all these cool, beautiful little things in that clock. But you take the finest little ruby in that watch, in that Rolex watch or whatever, and put it in that clock, and now that beautiful ruby becomes part of something greater than itself. Okay? And that's the same thing I'm talking about. It's not that that ruby has no value by itself. It's a beautiful thing. But as part of the watch, as part of the Rolex, it is part of something greater than itself, but it doesn't lose any of its beauty. It just has more function in a greater, in the greater scheme of things. And that's what the moon really needs to feel happy. And in the sun's hora, it always feels a little separated and isolated from that. And so in a woman's chart, it makes a woman always feel like she's not getting what she really needs, and pursuing other things that she thinks will give that happiness, but because there's not that connectivity there of the moon being in the moon's hora, it always eludes the person. So whether you're male or female and you got the moon in the sun's hora, it's harder to have that satisfaction. So, but it's more important in a woman's chart than a man's chart. But it's nice to have both the sun and moon in the right hora. But that's only going to happen, in, let's see, there's a 50% chance your sun's in the good place and a 50% chance in the moon's. So on 25% of people, they'll have the sun and moon in a good hora. 25% of people will have both of them in the wrong hora. And half the people will have one in each. Okay? So, the odds aren't too bad against you for having both in, but still you're going to find most people that come into your office as an astrologer are going to usually just have one or none, because there are going to be more unsatisfied people. And that's why they start pursuing things like astrology and trying to figure things out, because they're less satisfied. So when the sun and moon are in the wrong horas, it reduces the satisfaction you're going to have in your material concrete life. And everything that's concrete in your life is going to reduce your satisfaction if they're backwards. And that sucks, right? Totally sucks. But because there's that dissatisfaction with material life, lots of times you'll see that motivate people to pursue other avenues in life. Okay, like knowledge, spirituality, and whatever. And you will find a lot of spiritually advanced people who have those things backwards. Okay, so don't think that because of the fact that you got your sun or moon in the wrong hora that you're doomed to a life of misery. No, it just means you're doomed to a life of not finding satisfaction in the concrete world. Because again, the hora has to do with your concrete responsibilities, the things you have to take care of in life. If you don't have the capacity to find satisfaction in those things, you're going to search for that satisfaction elsewhere. Okay? So while it will make your material life less satisfactory, it doesn't limit you to a greater life outside of that. Okay? So before you start thinking it's all over, there's still lots of other Varga charts to give happiness, even if the hora chart is afflicted. And of course, it's because of dissatisfaction with material life that people eventually just take the sannyas and take through their meditation, take through their spiritual life, right? That's why people do it. When material life just falls into place and we feel satisfied with everything, we don't have that motivation, okay? So the hora is very much, it's an artha varga. It has to do with our material responsibilities, but it's not the entirety of our life, okay? I know I'm acting like it is as I teach the course, and when I do the Drekana course, I'll emphasize it like it's the only varga that matters. But every varga matters in its context. In the context of our material life, our material security, in the context of that, the hora rules, okay? But we still have so many other vargas to examine and find our happiness with if we failed it in the hora. Okay, so always check out the hora of the sun and moon and see if they're in their own horas, which is ideal, or if they're in the opposite, it's less ideal. And right then and there, the person's capacity for material or satisfaction with their material responsibilities is going to be reduced, no matter what the other planets are saying. Sun and moon set that foundation. Okay. Now, as far as the other planets, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn are concerned in the hora of the sun or moon. Some classical books will say, give results for Mars in the hora of the sun, Mars in the hora of the moon, Mercury in the hora of the sun, Mercury in the hora of the moon, and so on. And those texts, they give bad effects for every planet in the hora of the sun, and nice, enjoyable effects for every planet in the hora of the moon. They basically say, we want all the planets in the hora of the sun, and all the planets, or we want no planets in the hora of the sun, and we want all the planets in the hora of the moon. But that's not true. In fact, the sutra we just covered said the sun is strong in the hora of the sun. But these other sutras, they go on to say that the sun makes you a mean person in hora of the sun and a nice person in hora of the moon. Okay? Those sutras, we're not going to cover those, but in case you encounter them, I want to touch on them. Those sutras are dealing with things from a completely different paradigm. They're not dealing with things from the concept of you are a satisfied, healthy, dynamic person who can find satisfaction and happiness in your life. They're talking about, are you a sun-centered person, an active, dynamic, powerful, aggressive person, which is going to do what you think is right, even if it steps on some people's toes? Or are you a totally feminine, receptive, easygoing, go-with-the-flow person, no matter what society says, you're just going to kind of trample along, follow your societal roles, and live like that. And in Indian culture and Kali culture, so much of society was all about everyone just culturally fitting in with each other. It wasn't about being an individual and finding your individual path and finding your true way to your satisfaction. It was all about just fitting into the mold of the culture. And for that, the moon's hora is easier because the moon is adaptable and can hide a lot of its needs. That's the interesting thing about the moon. It has so many needs, but at the same time, it has such a capacity to hide and ignore its needs. And that's because half the moon is always invisible from Earth. We never see the backside of the moon from Earth. That's the whole world of feelings and needs that we don't show to people. So the moon has this great capacity to hide things, but also has a great capacity to reveal things. So it can do both. And it's always doing both. There's always some things we're hiding while we're revealing lots of other things to people, right? As we relate to them. So the moon has those two functions. So, in Kali Yuga Hindu society, when those sutras were put down in pen, they wanted people to be docile, fit into the culture, not stir the pot type people. Okay? Marry the people their parents say to, and so on and so on. And that's really not the way the planets are meant to live. There's malefic planets and cruel planets and tough planets and nice, gentle planets for a reason, because we need to exert both parts of that individuality. And planets in the sun's hora have a greater capacity to urge us towards that, because we'll sacrifice our personal relationships if we have planets in the hora of the sun to do what we think we have to do. We won't do that if we have planets in the hora of the moon. So because the Indian Hindu culture has been such a socially centered culture, those books wanted your planets in the hora of the moon so you'd be socially adaptable. Okay? But the truth is, we want the sun in the hora of the sun And like Parashar says, we want also Mars and Jupiter, the male planets, to be in the Hora of the Sun. And Mercury, if he's in a male sign, to be in the Hora of the Sun. Then we want Moon, Venus, and Saturn to be in the Horas of the Moon. And then we want Mercury, if in a female sign, to be in the Hora of the Moon too. Okay? So we have completely different, what's really right, what really works, what really creates satisfaction in a person. And that's what we're going to follow. But I wanted to mention what those other texts said. So if you come across that, you won't say, wait a minute, these texts say something totally different. They do, and that's the reason why. Okay? So we have to remember to keep things in the context of the culture that builds them. For instance, in those same old books, when they talk about your spiritual life, and if you've got afflictions to your spiritual life, you know what that means in the old books? It means you'll become a Buddhist. Because at that time, there was a lot of political conflict between Buddhists and Hindus. And so at that point, being a Buddhist became a stigma. So if your horoscope had some afflictions to your spiritual life, you became a Buddhist, which means you practice an inferior religion, you know. And we know that's not true. We know that we don't look at Buddhism that way. You know, Buddhism is equal to Hinduism in most people's lives. In fact, it's considered an aspect of Hinduism almost. But back then, 700 AD and so on, that was not so. Being a Buddhist was a derogatory term. Okay? So some of the things in these old textbooks, you know, that were written by just as human astrologers, and some were even written by human kings who were astrologers, who had also political motivations and stuff. You have to take in the context of the cultural scene at the time, and not as gospel truth. Okay? All right. So, we got all these other planets in their horas. Now, the male planets, the masculine planets find satisfaction in doing things that are great. Okay? They're not concerned with personal intimacy. That's the realm of the feminine. It's the feminine side of us, the lunar side of us, that needs that intimacy with our fellow mankind. Touch and affection, caring, love, and that personal affection and care for people. That's what the female signs, or female planets, and the moon and the moon's hora needs. And Saturn as well needs that, as I explained in the class before this. But the male planets, they need to be appreciated for what they do, but in an impersonal way. You know, a male planet needs to go save the world, see his name in the headlines, Mars saved the world. That's all he needs. He doesn't need to save the world, come home, sit on his couch, have his family jump on him and say, oh, Daddy, you're wonderful, you saved the world. We love you so much. No, that's not what he wants. He wants to save the world in a way that's impersonal. Okay? Meaning he wants the fact that he saved the world to be appreciated. He doesn't want to be appreciated for saving the world. He wants everyone to know that he saved the world because that's the truth. He did it. But he doesn't want everyone to love him because he saved the world. You know what I mean? He doesn't want everyone to want to be his friend because he saved the world. In fact, when he goes out and saves the world, everyone knows who he is and everyone wants to be his friend. He's not going to want to be friends with any of those people. Okay? He's just going to consider them irritations in his life. He doesn't want what he does to be personal. He wants what he does to be important for the world at large, but not in a way that connects him to other people. Because when he gets connected to other people, he starts feeling stifled and limited by those people to do in a moment what he feels he needs to do to take part of fulfilling his responsibilities to the world at large. Okay? All the male planets are like that. Mars, Jupiter, and Sun all have that quality where they don't want personal relationships to stifle what they're going to do next. They don't want what people believe about them personally to limit what they're going to do next. They don't want emotional attachments to people and people to them to limit what they're going to do next. Okay? So all those planets want to be in the hora of the Sun, where they have the capacity to sacrifice the intimate and personal needs to fulfill what they feel is their greater responsibility towards the world. And those three planets can only do that effectively if they're in the Hora of the Sun. And also Mercury's the same when he's in a male sign. Okay? If those three planets are in the Hora of the Moon, then the person's responsibilities of revolving around those planets get confined to more personal relationships and personal things. And so they feel stifled and they feel like they want to do more but they can't. Okay? So say a person has Jupiter in the Hora of the Moon. And say he's really wise. Say his Jupiter's is in the Pada, which makes a person wise, or it's within the Swamsha. It's with the Atmakaraka. So it makes a person have innate wisdom and understanding. But it's in the Hora of the Moon. So that innate wisdom and understanding gets limited to his intimate and personal relationships, his family, and so on, who, as it always is, most of the time don't even want to listen to the wisdom he has, right? Because he's just a person to love and have around and enjoy, which is what our family's for. We love them for you, but we don't want to hear your preaching and hear your beliefs and hear your advice on things. That's how families are, right? Jupiter wants to be in the Hora of the Sun, where he gets global responsibilities and he gets to go write a book that people read, or become a preacher, or become a philosopher, where people really want to know what he has to say because it's wise. Not having to be stuck with his family that makes him feel loved and gives him food and hangs out with them and wants to go on vacation with them, but doesn't care anything for the wisdom he has as an individual. You know what I mean? So that's sort of the difference. The Moon's Hora always gives that intimacy and care that doesn't have to do with anything that you do. I love you because you're family. I don't care that you're dumb. I don't care that you're wise. You're just as fun to hang out with, go barbecuing with, snuggle up against and watch movies with, eat dinner with, cook for, cook with, as a wise person or as a dumb person. You know, that's the Moon's Hora. It's that familial acceptance of personal relationships with people who like each other because of some intimacy and not because of what the other person's capable of or what the person does. But Jupiter, Mars, Sun, they don't want that. They want to do. They're male planets. They have to do and be appreciated for what they do. And when they're stuck in personal environments, they're just not going to have that level of fulfillment and satisfaction. They start feeling stifled and limited and restricted, frustrated. Okay? So we want those planets to be in the Hora of the Sun. Mars very much wants to serve and protect. That's his nature. Mars wants to see problems, fix problems, move on to the next problem. Okay? That's how Mars is at his best. You know, he's a warrior. He's a fighter. He's a soldier. You know, he has the most martial attitude of wanting to fix things and find satisfaction in protecting, fixing, and whatever, you know, overcoming problems. And he simply finds satisfaction in that. Okay? And but if those relationships become personal, then he starts feeling nagged. And he starts feeling nagged because he starts feeling like, why doesn't anyone else take care of their own stuff? Why are they always coming to me to help them with this or that, or to fix their things? Why don't they just do it? And then he starts feeling irritated by their weakness when it comes to personal relationships. But in a personal way, you know, that same person with that same Mars, Mars is going down the street, sees somebody stranded on the side of the road, you know, he's happy to fix the car, get him on the road, and he finds satisfaction in that, and the guy offers him $20. He says, no, I'm just happy to help. I don't want your $20. Okay? Just happy to have been of service in a time of need to somebody, in a time of need where you can actually do something about it. Not a time of need where they hold their hands and pat you on the head, but a time of need like, I fixed your car, I pulled the bullet out of you because I'm a surgeon, I gave you heart surgery, I shot the guy who was chasing you in an alley, you know, in the time of need like that, in a martial time of need. But if that Mars goes home, and then his wife says, you know, you still haven't fixed the car, you know, then he's like feeling nagged, and that's not how Mars likes it. Mars doesn't find satisfaction where he's told to fix things, where he's nagged to fix things, you know, where he has these personal relationships that put demands upon him. He likes to fix things in an impersonal way. And then he finds satisfaction and he feels like he's doing his duty towards the world. He Because again, it's the male planets, Sun, Mars, and Jupiter, and Mercury when it's in a male sign, that have a need to fulfill the duty towards the world. The other planets have a need to fulfill the duty towards our ancestors and family, remember? So when Mars is in that moon's hora, it's stuck fulfilling responsibilities to its ancestors. And so it feels burdened by all the things it has to do when fixed. Things that would happily do in an impersonal relationship and find validation in, it finds cumbersome to do for their intimate relationships. It's not rewarding because it's not centered towards those, towards finding satisfaction in those ancestral or familial and personal responsibilities. Okay? Then Jupiter. Jupiter is all about shedding light. And that's the light of knowledge, the light of wealth, and wisdom. Okay, Jupiter rules wealth too, and wealth, money is light too. In times of darkness, money helps. Not to be material about it, but so many problems that people suffer can be solved just if they had $100. There's people in other countries whose all their problems would disappear if they just had $100 to buy food for a few months, or food for a year in some places, right? That's what their problems are. So there's so many problems that will be solved with money, and that will be the light to them. And for other people, it's wisdom, religion, philosophy. That's the light they need. And Jupiter is the planet that has the abundance within us, whether the abundance of wealth or the abundance of knowledge, that just naturally pours off us onto those of lesser means, meaning those of lesser knowledge or lesser wealth. Again, Jupiter is named Guru, which means heavy. And a teacher is called Guru because he's heavier in knowledge than the person who calls him Guru. Okay? So, and things flow from heavy to empty. So someone who has an abundance of wealth and abundance of knowledge, that's going to naturally flow off them to the person of lesser money and lesser knowledge. And that's what Jupiter is meant to do. And that's how it spread its light or its abundance. Okay? And Jupiter enjoys doing that because it's his abundance. It's the excess that pours off him, that he doesn't even need for himself, that he's happy to see benefiting other people. So when he's in the Sun's hora, which is where he wants to be, he's able to give that in an impersonal way. And that means he's able to give it in a bigger way. He's able to give hope, light, and then move on and wish for the best for that person to do with that thing as they're able, according to their ability. But when Jupiter gets stuck in the hora of the moon, then his abundance can only reach his personal relationships. His ancestral karmas limit the extent of his abundance. So instead of him having time and the free will, the luxury, we could say, of donating money to this charity, he's there getting nagged by his kids. Say you got a really rich guy who want more money to go to college on, or who want more money because they don't want a college, And that burdens him because they just want my money and they're just going to squander it. He'd rather just give that money to some institution or a charity or to the dog pound or something, where he feels like it'll spread light. But instead, he's just giving it to a family member who's being useless or taking advantage of in easy living. And that's frustrating to Jupiter. So he doesn't like being stuck in those familial environments where he feels like he's the banker for everyone that is just giving free loans away that are never repaid. Because that's not really shedding light. But that's how his abundance gets shed if he's in the hora of the moon. Or he may have a lot of pearls of wisdom which don't matter to the family members. Okay? And so there's not that level of satisfaction. He's not able to use his abundance, whether it's wealth or knowledge, to benefit the world at large. It only benefits the narrow confines of his family. And while it may benefit them in a great way, maybe the kids really use that wealth to become better people and to go to college and to do great things, it still feels very limiting and restrictive to Jupiter. And it doesn't feel purposeful enough. And so Jupiter's simply not satisfied when he's in the Hora of the moon. He wants to be in the Hora of the sun. Okay, finally, the other planet we want in the Hora of the sun is, of course, the sun. Okay, which we've already talked about. But one thing I wanted to add to that is that the sun represents our spirit of sacrifice in general. The sun is the planet of sacrifice because, we sacrifice things to the sun. So the sun is the planet that asks us to make sacrifices and the planet that helps us find satisfaction and meaning in making sacrifices. So when he's in the sun's Hora, the person's able to sacrifice personal things for the greater impersonal things. Okay? And that satisfies the sun. Okay, that's the nature of the sun. He finds satisfaction of giving up his smaller things, which means the things of the ego, for the greater good. That's a quality of the sun. It's like the king who gives up the happiness of a good life for the burdens of a kingdom. Okay? And kings who don't do that aren't kings, they're tyrants, right? Which is the problem we have in the Middle Ages, and therefore we got rid of kings. But in the higher ages, in the Satya and Treta Yugas, kings were not like that. Kings gave up their own personal happinesses without a thought for the happiness of their people and their culture. Rama, Lord Rama is a perfect example of that, who gets banished, does what his father says, comes back 14 years with his wife. Somebody says something bad about his wife and that she shouldn't live with him anymore. So he said his first duties to the people of his kingdom, and he sent his wife off to live with the Rishi Valmiki. So he gave up the only thing he cared about in life. It was his wife. The only thing he cared about on earth was really was Sita. Gave her up without a thought because of a single complaint, by his kingsmen. So we see the spirit of sacrifice that the old kings of old in legend have made. And that's the nature of the sun. It's easily able to give up its own desires, needs, and wants for the wants of the kingdom. Okay? And the sun can do that in the sun's Hora. And he feels like the sacrifice is worthwhile. But if you get the sun in the moon's Hora, instead of making a sacrifice that's worthwhile, the sun ends up sacrificing other things it really feels it needs to do, just to maintain, say, the family harmony. And so it's like a sacrifice that doesn't feel like it's a productive sacrifice. Okay? The sun likes to make productive sacrifices. So we want that sun in the sun's Hora. Mercury we're going to cover last, because Mercury can go either way. The moon we covered. We'll talk about a little more. The moon, Venus, and Saturn we want in the moon's Hora. Because those three planets need personal relationships and intimacy in order to feel satisfied. Okay? They're not satisfied with doing things in an impersonal way. Especially the moon is not satisfied with doing things in an impersonal way. The moon needs that personal intimacy that allows it to feel connected and bonded to something that makes it better than being by itself. Okay? Like the gem in the clock. It's a beautiful gem, but as part of the watch, it's even more beautiful and more useful than by itself. Okay? So the moon craves that, and she can only have it if she's in the Hora of the moon. If she's in the Hora of the sun, she just doesn't have the ability to make those intimate connections in a way that feel validating enough and satisfactory enough. Okay? So the moon we talked about quite a bit just in the previous section. Now Venus, of course, is a planet of relationship. In some ways more than the moon. Okay? We could say that the moon is our need to be loved and our need to be in an intimate environment with people and to be emotionally connected to someone. It's that social urge. But the Venus is the planet that we use to fulfill that social urge. Okay? And Venus is very much a planet of creating win-win situations. For Venus, what's important is my satisfaction and happiness and your satisfaction and happiness equally. That's what's important to Venus. And Venus wants to get into relationships where both people are benefiting equally from the relationship, where both people get along better as a result of both people are better off together than they are alone. And that's the only reason Venus wants to be in relationships. Okay? And so they want for themselves as much as they want for the other people. So when you're in love with someone, you pull your Venus out, you want to be loved by them as much as you want to love them. Right? That's Venus. And to do that, because it's a win-win situation, Venus needs to be in the hora of the moon. Because when Venus is in the hora of the sun, which is the hora of sacrifice, relationships are not win-win. At that point, the spirit of sacrifice interferes with that, and therefore Venus feels really unsatisfied and eventually feels taken advantage of and isolated and unloved. Venus needs to be in the hora of the moon, where it can create an intimate, personal, win-win relationship where both people need each other to further their lives equally. Okay? And it can do that when it's in the hora of the moon. And when the person has Venus in the hora of the moon, they have the capacity to relate in an intimate way that creates a strong bonding between them. Okay? Venus is the planet of marriage. It rules the bond of marriage. When it's in the hora of the moon, a person can have that bonding marriage. They have that intimate capacity to bond with somebody. When Venus is in the hora of the sun, there's an impersonal quality to that person's relationships, where they're never going to bond to somebody to the degree that they only want to be with that person. To them, relationships are more impersonal. If they can have a win-win situation with another person, they'll as easily cultivate that win-win situation as this win-win situation with this person. They don't get narrowly defined into this is the only person I'm going to have this win-win situation with. They're like, I could have it with 1 million people. It just depends what destiny brings. So they're less personal in their relationships. In their relationships, when it's in the sun, it's this, we could say, the spirit of love that's more important than the person that they love. So a person who has Venus in the hora of the sun can love many people equally because it's the spirit of love that is interesting to them. But they never are able to love fully and completely intimately because they don't have that ability to connect personally with somebody completely. And because of that, when Venus is in the hora of the sun, a person's never able to be satisfied with anyone they encounter. No matter how desirable that person is, how much they like that person, how well they get along, there's still always something there that keeps them from completely bonding to that person, to where they really feel like they belong with that person and only that person. Okay? And that happens when the Venus is in the hora of the moon. So Venus just does not form as strong of bonds and relationships when it's in the hora of the sun as in the moon. It's too impersonal. It's a more impersonal planet. And therefore it's not satisfied because Venus craves that deep personal satisfaction with the people it's with. In the hora of the sun, it can't have that. It can have impersonal relationships, but they're never as fulfilling to Venus, okay, as when Venus is in the hora of the moon, okay? I wrote a little bit more about that as well, but that's the essence of Venus. And to take Venus beyond the realm of just relationships, we should talk about that a little bit too. Venus represents not just our human relationships, but it represents the important decisions we make in life. Okay? When we have a crossroads and we have to decide, should I go left or right, we decide based on what's going to be more worthwhile for me to do. What's going to fulfill more of my needs? What's going to be more worthwhile? When Venus is in the hora of the moon, a person is more readily able to see what's really going to be the most worthwhile choice for me. Okay, which choice is going to give me the most fulfillment? When he's in the hora of the moon, he can sense that better. When Venus is in the hora of the sun, oftentimes he'll sacrifice what would be most worthwhile for him to take a path that would lead to less satisfaction. So he a lot of times will satisfy his own needs for doing something that he thinks is greater, and that might satisfy planets like Mars and so on, but in the end, it leaves Venus feeling unsatisfied. So when Venus is in the hora of the sun, you'll find that a person will have made some choices in life some big choices in life. And lots of times these choices will include another person where they sacrificed an element of themselves or an element of what they needed in life for that thing or for that person. And as a result, Venus is not completely satisfied. And what Venus represents when it comes to satisfaction, Venus has to do with the emotional fulfillment that the world has to give us. So in essence, when Venus is in the hora of the sun, a person sacrifices some possibilities of emotional fulfillment to fulfill some other responsibility or duty, oftentimes towards a person, because Venus is so person-centered. As a result, they give up the opportunity for emotional happiness. They sacrifice that. So Venus in the hora of the sun sacrifices the opportunity for happiness and emotional fulfillment because of something they think is the right thing to do, or because of somebody they think it's the right thing to do for that person. One client I had, who had Venus there, very much liked a person and really felt like this person could be emotionally fulfilling, but changed their mind, decided to not go with that relationship because of, we can say, religious considerations. They didn't think it was the right thing to do at that time because of where that person was in life. And so they moved on and gave up a huge degree of emotional fulfillment that when I talked to him last, and it had been, I think that was like 10 years ago, 10, 11 years ago now, the person was still sort of regretting not having tried to focus on that relationship back then and having made that sacrifice for their greater belief system. Had Venus been in the hora of the moon, that person would have recognized more clearly the need of that person, the need for themselves, the need of that person in their lives, and then they would have been able to think of diplomatic, sensible ways, which is what Venus is a master of, making it work. Because that's what Venus is about. Venus is a planet that's able to smooth over problems. Mars and Venus are very related. Mars goes in there, and if he sees a problem, he cuts it out. He does surgery. Takes care of it. Okay? But Venus smooths it out. Okay? So, if you've got a little tumor in your arm, Mars comes over with a knife and chops it out. Venus comes over and just kind of works it and rubs it and smooths it out and gives you a massage, and eventually over time it works its way out and it's gone. So they both sort of fix things but in very different ways. Venus smooths things out. If Venus had been in the hora of the moon, this person would have somehow been able to understand how they could have smoothed out that difficulty and really have been with that person. But it wasn't. It was in the hora of the sun. So for them, it was just so much easier to sacrifice that need for emotional fulfillment that they felt with that person to their ideology. Okay? So that's sort of an example of how Venus in the hora of sun will make these sacrifices and therefore not have the level of emotional satisfaction in the things in their life, and the people in their life, especially in their marriage, as they would if they had Venus in the hora of the moon. Okay, Saturn. Saturn's a neuter planet, but he craves validation for who he is, not what he does. So while Saturn's capable of doing and also receiving, because he's a neuter, he has qualities of both male and female, he himself, what he really needs is validation though. So Saturn wants to be in the hora of the moon, where even though while he's doing the work that Saturn represents, he gets validated and loved for who he is and not what he's doing. So let's say you have a servant and you're a rich lord in England or something, and say the servant trims the hedges perfectly and keeps the perfect kitchen and makes the best cake and tea and biscuits and all that stuff that English used to eat and probably still do eat, imaginable. And if you say, oh, that's the nicest biscuit I've had, thank you very much, the hedges looked awesome, you've worked so hard, take a day off, and always telling this person how great their work is, that's not going to validate Saturn. Saturn, that servant's going to be happier if the Lord doesn't even compliment a single thing they do, but the Lord says, I'm going on a ride. Would you like to accompany? And we can just hang out and go on a ride on our horses and maybe chat a while. That's going to make the servant feel, wow, I'm a human, And he's like, I'm a person. He sees me as a person, as an individual who can enjoy a ride with him, that's worthy of a ride with him. That's going to be more validating to the servant than any compliment the Lord is going to make on the servant's work. You understand? So that's what Saturn wants. Saturn works so hard to make things good and right, but what he really wants, he just wants someone to say, look, you're just an awesome person, or I just really like you. I'm so glad you're a part of my life. And not because of anything they do, but because of who you are. So Saturn has that feminine need of being loved for who they are. They don't have the masculine, Saturn does not have the masculine need to be loved for what it does. And you can see this really easy. People who've got Saturn afflictions going on, they'll work really hard, and when you say, great job, they'll just kind of go, they don't even want to hear the compliment. You know what I mean? They're not looking for that. They want to be validated as an individual. So Saturn will be validated as a person if he has the capacity to reach intimate relationships. And he only can do that in the hora of the moon. And then he feels love for who he is while he's doing all the Saturnian tasks that is required of him. When Saturn is in the hora of the sun, though, he does all the Saturnian tasks required of him while sacrificing who he is. And so nobody cares about him. Nobody validates him as a person. When he's hurt, nobody cares. Nobody considers that he has wounds and hurts and a past and a history of tragedy like everybody else. People just expect him to fulfill his responsibilities, and without considering that he's also just a common man like everyone else when it comes down to it as a common man. Saturn rules the common man. Saturn rules democracy, those types of governments. Which everyone, when it comes down to it, is a common man, right? Just in different positions in life. So he won't be able to make those connections when he's in the hora of the sun. And so that need to be validated as a person, even though you're at the bottom, even though you've suffered, even though you've done evil things, even though you've done bad things that you regret, Saturn still needs to be validated as a desirable person. In the hora of the sun, it doesn't get that validation. It doesn't form the relationships that provide that validation. In the hora of the moon, Saturn gets that actually. So Saturn in the hora of the moon, the environment, the intimate environment they find themselves in will, and the familial environment, and I guess the personal environment it finds itself in, will validate its wounds and sufferings and bring about more of a psychological healing, which is what Saturn is in need of. Whereas when Saturn's in the hora of the sun, the environment that doesn't provide the intimate or personal relationships that really allow Saturn to heal psychologically. And so as a result, the person's esteem is much more, becomes much more rigid, doesn't heal, and becomes a much more greater burden to them. The things they've done, the pains they've borne, become a greater burden to them. And it'll also reduce the person's capacity to share those things. So a person with Saturn in the hora of the sun is a lot less likely to go to a psychotherapist than a person with Saturn in the hora of the moon. Okay? A person with Saturn in the hora of the moon comes to you just by validating that they're okay, that they've had a terrible life and done terrible things, can be really healing to them. Whereas the person who has Saturn in the hora of the sun, you could take and say that you look at the chart and you say, oh, you did this and this, and I can see this really has hurt you. And you can explain why it's okay. They're not going to get the same healing from that. They're just going to be sort of rigid against it. So it's harder to heal from our things we've done when Saturn's in the hora of the sun usually than it is in the moon. So those are a couple reasons we want Saturn in the moon's hora. Last planet is Mercury. Mercury is a dynamic planet that can just do anything. He's the most talented planet. He can rule a kingdom. He can clean a toilet. Mercury can do everything in between too. He's the most versatile. And he's a Rajasic planet, so he always adapts to the situation at hand. Okay? He always makes the best use of his abilities and intelligences given the situation at hand, which means he adapts and changes. And that's why in a watery place, he learns how to swim. In a fiery place, he learns how to weld. You name it. In a watery place, he learns how to fish. Whatever place Mercury's at, he becomes the perfect thing to manage life in that place. And so it's no different when it comes to the Horas. But the place he's at is the Rashi. The Hora is the energy he has to find satisfaction. And that's not adjustable. But it's the Rashi that adjusts him. So when Mercury's in a male Rashi, like Aries, Gemini, Leo, he takes on a masculine quality, meaning he's in a masculine place, which means he's going to try to adapt to a masculine individual in that masculine place, because that's what's required to be most effective. When Mercury's in a feminine place, in an even Rashi, like Taurus, Cancer, Virgo, and so on, he's going to be in a feminine place, so he's going to try to manage things in a feminine, receptive way. But how well he'll do those things depends on how he's geared. Is he really geared in a masculine way, or is he really geared in a feminine way? That depends on the Hora. If he's in the Hora of the Sun, he's geared in a masculine way, which means he's only going to find satisfaction if he's in a male sign. If the environment requires him to be masculine, and because it's a male sign, and he is masculine at heart because it's the Sun's Hora, then he's going to become king in that environment and be very satisfied. If, on the other hand, he's in a female sign, and so the environment is requiring him to be feminine to make the most of it, and he has his Mercury in a moon's Hora, so he's feminine geared, then he'll become the queen of that realm and master it. But if it's opposite, he'll fail. Okay? If he's in a male sign but geared femininity in a feminine way, he will not find satisfaction. Or if he's in a male sign or female sign and geared masculine by having being in the Sun's Hora, he won't find satisfaction. Now, there's two types of satisfaction Mercury has. Mercury has a great need to fulfill an obligation to the world, but also has a need for personal relationships in the form of friendships. So Mercury rules both the service we can give to the world, and he also rules the friendships we create, the personal friendships we create with people. When Mercury is in a male sign and in the Hora of the Sun, then he gets masculine responsibilities, meaning responsibilities to serve the world at large, and he has that spirit of sacrifice of the Sun's Hora. He has that initiative quality, and he has that impersonal quality to give and provide and serve the world and find fulfillment in it, or satisfaction in those responsibilities. But if he's in a male sign and he's in a female Hora, then he's really geared to have personal relationships, and therefore he's not able to serve the world at large as well. And he's not, since he needs more personal relationships, but he's geared in a more masculine way, it actually will push more personal relationships away from him and keep him from the intimacy that the moon Hora wants. And so then Mercury's just not going to be satisfied. And he won't be able to have also that Mercury in a male sign, but the moon's Hora will not have the spirit of sacrifice that will allow them to serve with Mercury in a detached way without feeling hurt. So they may, let's say, it's like a typical example, someone who's in an ashram serving and trying to give, but they're constantly getting their feelings hurt because Mercury wants a personal relationship with people too, but it's only getting the impersonal, so I start taking it personally that nobody wants to be my friend. But that's because that's not what the environment is requiring of them, but Mercury still craves it. So Mercury in a male sign, female Rashi, feels undervalued on a personal level as it goes about fulfilling its obligations to the world at large. Now what is the world at large? Mercury's obligations to the world at large. Well, I call it Vishwamitra, which means a friend of all. Vishwamitra was one of the great sages of all time. Actually, there's kind of a cool astrological story about him. At first, he was a king. And he had some fights with this one really powerful rishi. I believe it was Vashisht, if I remember correctly, who was Lord Rama's guru eventually. But he kept having these quarrels with these rishi that just led to these practical wars. But over time, this king evolved, and he started finding greater satisfaction in giving to other people than taking care of himself. And eventually he abandoned his kingdom. He became this great rishi, one of the greatest rishis of all time. But he would help anyone in need no matter what the cost to himself. In fact, there is one story where he was, I hope I tell it correctly, but you'll get the idea if I kind of mess it up a little bit. Where he was sitting there and I think he'd done penance for like almost 10 years. And he was, if he just could finish this penance, his spirituality and knowledge was going to increase 1,000-fold. So he had all the spiritual fruits right at his fingertips. But right at that time, a guy shows up in dire need. And what does Vishwamitra does? He jumps up, forgets that he's done 9 years and 300 days of penance that have all gone to waste. The minute he sits up, they go help this guy in something that was relatively not as important. So he goes and helps this guy whose name was Dhruva. And I don't remember how it worked out, but as a result of helping this guy ascend to what this person needed, Vishwamitra made this person the pole star. So it's the myth of the pole star, which is sort of interesting astrologically or astronomically. So Vishwamitra is the person, the rishi, responsible for putting the pole star where it is. Okay? So you can see the power this guy has. But really he's just a person who's willing to sacrifice his own thing for an impersonal friendship. He's a friend of all. It's an impersonal relationship. Mercury in the male sign in the sun's hora has that capacity to really be a friend of all. Mercury in the hora of the sun wants to be a friend of all. He wants to be good and help everyone he encounters in an impersonal way, in whatever way he can best serve that person. And he'll find happiness in doing that for a person, even if it causes him to have to give up his own personal agenda. But when that Mercury that's in the hora of the sun, who has that spirit, is in a female sign, the world doesn't give him the venue, the path to fulfill that. So his need for friendships, which he finds his only satisfaction in impersonal friendships, isn't there. And he doesn't get to be the friend of all that his spirit really craves, unfortunately. Okay? Now, when the other part of Mercury is it wants personal friendships. It wants my best buddy. You know, it wants the buddy you go fishing with, your study buddy, whatever. It's your friend you grew up with from 6th grade, and you still hang out and go camping and take your family camping, whatever. That's, or like in India, so many people have these friends that they have from high school onward the rest of their lives that come to their grandchildren's weddings, you know. These friends are respected as elders in the family, you know. So these really personal friendships, Mercury also has that capacity too. Now when Mercury's in the hora of the moon, that's when Mercury craves and has the spirit for those type of friendships. Okay? Those personal friendships where a person's always going to be there for that person because they are their personal friend. They're not just going to be that person because they were walking down the road and bumped into them and so they were their friend for an hour and then moved on, like Mercury in the sun's hora is inclined to do. It's going to be their friend because it's a personal, important thing to them. And when Mercury's in the hora of the moon, and in a female sign, their life gives them the luxury of having that kind of friendship. They have the time and receptivity to cultivate those types of friendships, which a large part of those friendships revolves around passive behavior, just sort of hanging out and knowing each other. But when Mercury's in the hora of the sun, that Mercury is always busy doing this, in a male sign, then that Mercury is always busy doing this or doing that or doing this. So it doesn't have the time to really fulfill that personal friendship urge that Mercury has by being in the hora of the moon. As a result, Mercury is less satisfied with its friendships. Okay? Or even if they're not too busy to establish concrete, long-lasting friendships, their friend will be that way. So Mercury's in a male sign. That shows their friend who's really busy and active and going here and there. And then Mercury's in the Hora of the moon, needing that more personal friendships, but not finding one that really works completely. So that's some examples how Mercury works. It's always about friendship and service to people for Mercury. But is it done in a personal friendship or in an impersonal friendship? That's determined by the Hora of the moon for personal, Hora of the sun for impersonal. And our lives come together to have those type of friendships. Well, for impersonal, when Mercury's in a male sign, and for personal, when Mercury's in a female sign. Okay? So Mercury gets a little tricky. Alright, so that's like a breakdown of the concepts behind these planets being in desirable or undesirable horas. Expand those ideas to other things these planets rule. The concept will hold true about everything these planets rule and represent. Okay? Okay, then some of the texts, they give some results of the Lagna. They usually focus, when they do focus on talking about what Vargas do in any of the old texts, about the Varga of the Lagna. You know, where does that Lagna fall in the Horas, the important thing? What is it? Jataka Parikshita says, if the Lagna is in an odd sign, like Aries, Gemini, and the Hora is presided by the sun, the person will be of cruel disposition, lustful, rich, and honored by kings. So he's cruel. Well, that means he's masculine. He's aggressive. He goes after he wants. Not things that are really considered ideal in a Hindu society where everyone wants to conform and flow together as a social unit and not as an individual. But odd sign, sun's Hora, makes a person masculine, outgoing, active, aggressive, energetic. He's going to do what he thinks is right. Okay? Though they write that down with a little bit of unpleasantness, because again, it wasn't ideal for that culture. If the Lagna is in an odd sign, and the Hora is that of the moon, the person will be eloquent, liberal, handsome, compassionate, but will have an intriguing wife. So see, this person will fit into society easier, he'll be easier to get along with, but there's something wrong in his life because he has an intriguing wife. And in the old text, when they say you have an intriguing wife, they basically blame your problems on your wife, because they love doing that in Hinduism, you know. They love blaming everything that's wrong in your life with your wife. But we really know that if something wrong with your wife, it's really because you have an internal problem yourself. So this person's not quite right to have an intriguing wife. And ironically enough, you'll find that people with the Lagna and odd sign and the Hora of the moon, the person will be a lot like this. They'll have, everything will seem really nice on the surface, they'll be a nice person, but there's always something missing or wrong with their relationship. Okay? For some reason. But an odd sign and Hora of the moon, it makes for a person who is geared masculine because they're in the, they're geared in a feminine way because they have their Lagna in the moon's Hora, which means their path is going to be more receptive, their nature is going to be more receptive. But still, the Lagna is in an odd sign, and that means an odd sign in the Rashi chart, which also actually make it an odd sign in the Hora chart, so either way. But then their path requires more action of them. But then they're geared actually more feminine, okay, meaning more lunar Hora. So there's a bit of a contradiction in that person. And you're usually going to find people can go the furthest when they have an odd sign and odd Hora, or a female sign and female Hora, and moon's Hora, so they can just go full bore. When you've got a mixed odd sign female Hora or female sign odd Hora, the nature of the person is not working in concordance completely with the path that they're on. The guy with an odd sign is on a path that's going to require initiative. When his Lagna is in the Hora of the sun, he can really take initiative. When the Lagna is in an odd sign, like I said, the person's path is going to require them to take initiative, but then they're geared in a more feminine way if the Lagna is in a moon's Hora. So they're really just like things that come to them. So they'll be able to, follow the ideal very easily of the Tao Te Ching, to know the male but stick to the female, which means to let things come into your life that come, and then be masculine about what you do with them, and do the right thing, and fulfill your responsibilities, and take action with those things once they come. But with respect to marriage, that won't work really great, because when it comes to marriage for a man, the man really has to want the girl and know he wants her and go after her and feel like he really got her, and then he wants her the rest of his life. If she just kind of comes into his life and then he takes her and does the right thing with her, part of him won't be fully satisfied with that girl. So if he has an intriguing wife, there's something that's not completely satisfactory about his marriage life. And of course they blame it on the fact that his wife is intriguing, but the truth is because the person didn't have the capacity to find the wife, to find a woman they really wanted and go and get her. Instead, a woman came and he took her and did the right thing. Okay? So it doesn't create quite the satisfaction in marriage life. Now, in a woman's chart, a woman who has her Lagna in an odd sign and in the Hora of the moon will more often be more receptive to the right guy coming into her life. So these sutras are very much written from a man's point of view, for a man's horoscope. For a woman's horoscope, it's actually very desirable, no matter whether her Lagna is odd or even, to have the moon or have the Lagna in the Hora of the moon. And actually for a man's chart, it's better always for the Lagna to be in the Hora of the sun in general, to have greater satisfaction. Okay? Now they also say, if the Lagna is even and the Hora is the sun, one will be clever in counsel, sensible of favors received, but irresolute and exceedingly timid. And then if the Lagna is an even and the Hora is a moon, one will be fearless in speech, lazy, and fond of a virtuous wife. So let's take that last one. If the Lagna is even, they're on a feminine, receptive path, and the Hora is of the moon, which makes them geared in a feminine, receptive, personal way, one will be fearless in speech, lazy, and fond of a virtuous wife. So these are mostly good qualities, except lazy. But lazy kind of means they're laid back, they're very receptive. It just means they're not going to be an initiative, get up and go type person, which really isn't a bad quality to have. If you're fearless in speech, which means you say what you believe, and you have a good spouse, that's awesome. This just represents a person who has those things, but they're a more relaxed, laid-back, non-initiative person because they're very much geared in a feminine way. Now, in a man's chart, being geared that feminine, to that degree in a feminine way, can present some problems about him going out and getting what he wants. But since that's his nature, it won't be really much of a problem. In a woman's chart, an even Lagna with the Hora in with the Hora falling in that of the moon, that's the perfect ideal. That's the best thing in a woman's chart. A woman who has an even Hora with moon's Hora rising has more room for satisfaction and happiness in life. And a man with the sun's Hora and the Lagna in an odd sign has more capacity for happiness and satisfaction in life, all other factors equal. Okay? So, again, because moon's more important in a woman and sun's more important in man, those sun's Horas favor men more and female Horas favor women more. Okay? In fact, taking that idea another important step, if you have a guy and he has all of his planets, his male planets in the moon's sun's Hora where they should be, and all of his female planets in the wrong Hora, he'll be happier by far than having all the female planets in the right Hora and the male planets in the wrong Hora. And for a woman, it's more important in her chart to have the female planets in the female Horas than it is to have the male planets in the male Horas for overall satisfaction. Because if the feminine, body with the feminine brain and feminine endocrine system, hormonal system, is going to find greater satisfaction in the lunar Hora than in the male Hora. And same for the male. Males will find more satisfaction when their male planets are in the male Horas. in the sun's hora than if the female planets are in the female horas, because it's more important for each person to find satisfaction in respect to their gender. Ideally, we want to find satisfaction in respect to our gender and also to the unconscious half of our psyche, which in a man is the feminine half and which in the woman is the masculine half. And we really crave fulfillment for both halves of our psyche. But if we only can have one half fulfilled, a man will be better off and happier if the male side is satisfied, and the woman will be more satisfied if the female side is satisfied. So if you only have one, you want it to go that way. But you always want both, because we're both all male and female. We all have masculine and feminine needs that we really need to fulfill to have full satisfaction. Alright, so getting back to this. If the line is even and the hora is of sun, one will be clever in counsel, sensible of favors received, but irresolute and exceedingly timid. So this person, has some strengths. They're clever, that's a strength of the sun. They're sensible, which is a strength of the sun. But they're a little irresolute and timid, which is the feminine lagna getting in the way. Okay? So ideally you want male rising, male sun, and be a male, or female rising, moon's hora, and be female. Okay, those are the best two for full satisfaction. Now, if you're female and you've got a sun hora and a male lagna, you can do a lot of great things in the world. But the emotional satisfaction will not be as great as having a moon hora. Okay? And if you're male and you've got an even Rashi with this moon's hora, a lot of nice things will happen in your life, can happen in your life. You got a capacity to welcome a lot of beauty and love and wondrous things into your life. But you won't be as satisfied as if you had a male sign and a male sun and a sun's hora. Okay? So those are the sort of the extremes, or the opposites. Okay? Either one of those can give a lot of success. It's just the one will give more satisfaction than the other. Okay, so the hora of the lagna is important to some degree, but not as important as the hora of the sun or the moon, which is really the most important. And the reason it's more important is because the grahas are the conscious entities in the chart. Okay, the grahas represent the consciousness. They're the intelligences within us. So we need the intelligence, the consciousness to be happy, right? The sun and the moon and the other planets. The lagna is the body and the path that we're on. So it's our male body or our female body, the male or female path that we're on, and so on. The more active or receptive path that we're on. If we're more if our body's more full of testosterone and initiative, or if our body's more full of estrogen and receptivity, that's what the lagna is talking about. But for our consciousness to be happy, that's what's really important, is our consciousness satisfied. That's more important. So sun and moon are more important than the lagna. So sun, moon, and then check out the lagna. Okay? Okay, then the last thing we're going to cover today are the effects of horas according to Saravelli and Yavana Jataka. So, in this part of the handout, there's some stuff in italic, which is from Yavana Jataka, and the non-italic is from Saravelli. Saravelli is like 600-something AD work that is based on Yavana Jataka. But you'll see some slight difference in the sutras between these two, so I decided just to put both. Some of the differences are just attributed to the different translators, who are going to have put down a slightly different meaning for the same Sanskrit word. I haven't been able to compare if the Sanskrit in Saravelli is the same as the Sanskrit in Yavana Jataka, because unfortunately I don't have the Sanskrit from Yavana Jataka. Okay? And these are not translated by me. Anytime you see anything translated by me, it'll always have the Sanskrit transliteration, the Sanskrit words above the translation. If it doesn't have that, I didn't translate it. Okay? So, we've got effects of horas according to these two texts. And it's good to read both of these. For instance, horas and Aries according to Saravelli. If the first hora of Aries ascends at birth, the native will roll his eyeballs and necessarily Be cruel, rich, very bright in appearance, have a fierce wife, be tall, irascible, and a leader of thieves. And then Yavana Jataka says, the man born under the influence of the first hora of Aries has large red eyes, and the tip of his nose is like a parrot's. He is fierce, thick-set, and tall, fond of his wife, and a rich hero or leader of thieves. So this gives him the option of being a rich hero or leader of thieves. So it's nice to see that there's some, difference of opinion here. That's not like you're always going to be a leader of thieves, for instance, according to Saravelli. So you'll get different preferences for this hora or this hora. So it's good to have sort of both translations or both sources available to you. This one, Saravelli says have a fierce wife. The other one says he'll be fond of his wife. Okay? So there's some big differences between these two. However, I find that the use of these horas is a pretty decent description about a person and a better description than just looking at they have Aries rising and the description of Aries from the old books. Like I said in the previous class to this, the hora description and the hora image gives you a feel of the person much better so than the descriptions of the Lagna Rashi that are given in the old books. It's somehow a more personal description of what you're really going to experience as that person. Okay? So, you can use these the same way you use the images of the horas that we went over in the previous video. Read it, get a feel for the person. If you're trying to figure out what time of birth they're born, you got two options. Which one of these makes more sense? I just like to start by looking at the hora image that we covered in the previous video, the flamboyant, pictorial, symbolic image, because that gives you more of a feel. Well, this gets a little bit more into descriptions, like, for instance, horas in Libra. If the first hora of Libra sends at birth, one will have a round face, elevated nose and back, and large eyes. Be sportive and have a strong body and strong bones. Be wealthy and affectionate to his men. Well, I've found that people who've got that hora rising, they tend to have heavy bones. They tend to be big-boned people. Okay? They won't necessarily be big, meaty. They won't be big, meaty people, because big people are ruled by Aries, Leo, and Capricorn. Libra is a medium-sized person, meaning of medium width and height, unless, of course, other planets lengthen them or some shorten them. But regardless of that, they're always going to be bigger-boned people for their size. So if another planet shortens them, they're still going to be a bigger-boned short person. If another planet lengthens them, they're not going to be a scrawny, person with like a supermodel with tiny little bones. They're going to be a taller person with bigger bones. So it's just some of these similarities you'll find can be really helpful. So if I had a person come in and they had, their birth time said 15 degrees and 1 second of Libra, and I wanted to know if that was right, and I read the second hora of Libra. If the second hora of Libra sends at birth, one will be very wealthy and his wealth will be firm. One is endowed with black and curly hair, crafty, round-eyed, has a strong lower body and attractive skin, but defective feet. Well, I can compare that to the other description of Libra in the first hora. If I see they have a heavy set of bones, that they're a big-boned person, I can safely assume their birth time's a little too much, and I can knock off a few seconds and drop them into the first hora of Libra, which gives big bones, and doesn't give problems or defects in feet or weak feet, which second hora of Libra tends to do more often. So sometimes these descriptions can come in really handy to validate a person's birth date or time. They say, I'm not sure if this is my time, but this is what I think it was. And if you read it and there's nothing that resembles them at all, chances are it's not the right birth time. Okay? So these are useful in that. And I also just like to use them a lot if I want to just get a basic feel of the client, or when I meet somebody new and I'm curious about sort of what they're like, what their energy is going to be like. I like to read the images of the hora and then the than the results of the Lagna in the Hora, according to Saravelli and Giovanna Chattica. So they're pretty self-explanatory. Helps you get a feel for that person. It's just one isolated factor, though, so it's not going to describe the whole person. Only a few things will really be correct in those sutras for each person, and those few things can always be different, because on top of that Hora, we've got planets in the Lagna, planets aspecting the Lagna, we have the Lagna in another sign, the Lagna Lord in another sign, we have planets joining the Lagna Lord, aspecting the Lagna Lord, they have a sun, they have a moon, they have an Atmakaraka, those are in different signs, under influences. So the Hora of the moon, or the Hora of the Lagna, is not meant to explain the person as a complete thing. It's just meant to let us see a glimmer into what that person's like. But an easy to look up glimmer, so it's really handy. So use it in that context. Just use it on charts, starting with yourself, and you'll get a feel for it really quickly. Okay? So sometimes it's fun to have this simple, classical information to get a feel for the person. And that's what you use those for. You don't want to say, well, you don't want to say, gosh, you've got Hora in the first, Hora of Sagittarius, which just means you're an ascetic. Because it says he's an ascetic who had no guru in his youth. You don't want to predict, oh, you need to be an ascetic this lifetime because of that. You want to see if someone's meant to be an ascetic, you got to check if asceticism is their career according to Jaimini. But you could say, you have renunciate qualities where sometimes you think you could just let go of everything and just make, just sacrifice everything for true happiness and knowledge. And they say, sometimes I think all this is meaningless and I want something deeper. So that's how you could sort of work with the person with that. But you wouldn't want to say you're going to be an ascetic because you've got the first Hora of Sagittarius rising. Okay? So you have to use these in the proper context. And we'll be using these in the example classes. Everything we've gone over so far we will use in all the example horoscopes that we're going to start looking at shortly. We have one more section to cover, which is just a handful of yogas bearing on the Hora, which we want to go over. And after we've gone over those, we'll get into reading Hora charts and putting everything together.